have notes for each of my chapters within a chapter module in D2L. I'm actually going to be referring to some of this today, and this is partly because I'm giving you material that's in my notes that you ought to know, that the author does not expressly spell out terminology-wise. Having the terminology will be useful to you, because it's nice to know a little bit about logical analysis and the names attached to these valid argument forms. And just to reiterate something, for those of you who did the homework from last time, when we're going to be analyzing arguments, an argument that passes logical muster, we say is a sound argument. A sound argument must meet what two? Yeah. The premises, that is, the reason supporting the alleged conclusion, have got to be true. Now, the other criterion that it's got to meet is it's got to be valid. And I know I reiterated this before, it's not in the text, but I want to reiterate it again. Students frequently have difficulty with this word valid, especially in a logic class. And it's because of something I said previously. Because of a colloquial misusage of the word valid, many students think the word valid and true are synonymous with one another. They are not. Remember, validity is a measure of an argument's structure. An argument that is logically well constructed is valid. One that is not logically well constructed is invalid. Now, if an argument is valid, and we know for certain that its premises are true, its conclusion will necessarily also be true. Its conclusion will also necessarily be true. Now, part of what the author does in this chapter is runs through a number of specific cases, demonstrating cases where there are invalidity issues but true premises, thus the argument is unsound, or cases in which we've got a valid argument but false premises, and thus unsound. There is no such thing, and this was the question. It is impossible for an invalid argument to be sound. If an argument is structurally flawed, it cannot be sound. If an argument is indeed a sound argument, that is one that rational folks ought to accept, it's got to be valid and its premises have to be true. Now let's run through a short list of the ones in the textbook. And I do encourage you to get out your textbook if you have it. And this one I want to go over again, even though we already saw this one. From the current edition of the textbook, it is on page 11. This is the one about heroin. The first premise is heroin is a drug. The second premise is selling heroin is illegal. I hope my scroll on the board isn't too bad. Now I'm going to write my conclusion underneath this line. Therefore, heroin use is immoral. Now, for those of you who heard me run through this quickly in the past, you already ought to know what I'm going to say. This is a clear case of an authored illustration of one where we have an argument form that is invalid. Now, the reason why this argument form is invalid is because there's no necessary connection between the conclusion that we're trying to draw and the premises that have been stated. Now, both of these premises are what, folks? Say it loud. True. True. Heroin is indeed a drug. Lots of things are drugs. Selling heroin is illegal. Now, notice, folks, that here it's a drug, it's illegal. The conclusion attempts to draw a conclusion about heroin that is not mentioned even once in any of the premises. Yes?
I don't know. I think I have the wrong book. I'm not getting.
Oh, you're in the wrong book. Yeah, this is in the Fundamentals of Ethics, the only ones that we're working with just now. So this one is invalid, even though what? It's got all true premises, invalid structure. So you know this argument is what? Unsound. Now I want to make another statement about this. It may be the case that this conclusion may actually be what? The conclusion might actually be true. I'm not here to argue that. However, this conclusion cannot be drawn from these premises because the relevant connections have not been made. Now, the author's next example was that one on the next page. And I have this in my notes, even though it's not specifically mentioned in the textbook. The author presents a case of a valid structure called disjunctive syllogism. And I've said before that a disjunct is the or relationship. If we say something is X or it is Y, in order for that statement to be true, one of those two, X or Y, has to at least be true. Otherwise, that statement will be false. Now, here's the argument that the author sets up based upon this structure. He says, John Quincy Adams was either the 8th president of the United States or, this is not in the book, folks, this is the logical symbol that logicians in propositional logic use to stand in for the meaning or. John Quincy Adams was either the 8th president of the United States or he was the 9th president of the United States. Now, I hope all of you know that this statement is what? It's false. They made you memorize that he was the 6th president of the United States. Now, the second premise says, it is not the case that he was the 8th president of the United States. Now, this symbol, the tilde, this is the symbol that logicians use to stand in for the word not. Guess what conclusion we can draw? It's E or it's N, but it's not E, therefore N follows. Now, the distinction that's trying to be made here is we have a case of an argument form that is what? This is a valid logical structure. Now, we plug what into it? We've got a false premise. Therefore, this argument is what? It's unsound. We got a false premise. This premise turns out to be true. Now our conclusion turns out to be false. Folks, suppose that our conclusion by happenstance turned out to be true. Would that suddenly make the argument sound? The answer, good, I saw the head shakes. The answer should be no. Because remember, in order for an argument to be sound, it's got to be valid and all of its premises have to be true. Now, the next argument that I want you to look at, this one is also in the book. This is where the author turns to two of what he calls popular arguments made in favor of meat eating. Now, these arguments are going to help us to make two more distinctions about logical analysis. And for those of you who find this logical analysis stuff to be a little bit daunting, spend a little time with it, let it sink in, and we'll be seeing more of it. It will hopefully work out nicely. But do keep in mind, it sometimes takes some time for it to sink in. Let me read this argument for you. He calls this a popular argument for meat eating. It is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat each other. First premise. It is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat each other. Now, folks, this is already a peculiar argument compared to some of the ones we've already seen, because this argument only has one what? Starts with a P. Premise, thanks. And then we shift to the conclusion. Therefore, it is morally acceptable for human animals to kill and eat non-human animals. Now, a quick cut to the chase here, folks. The point the author is trying to make here is this one fails on two counts. This argument is structurally problematic. It is invalid. Any guesses what else is wrong with it? It's got a false premise. Now, unless you're really thinking about this premise, you may have erred and thought it was what? You may have thought that it was true. And by the way, many people at first glance do think it's true. They go, well, it's perfectly fine for non-human animals to eat non-human animals. They do it, A, and B, it's something they need to do to survive if they happen to be predator animals. These are some of the reasons that people might use to back that up. Now, the failure of this premise is it makes the claim that it is morally acceptable. Now, there's a distinction made in this chapter. You should probably have already seen it and already remember it. Most of you probably already aware that we do not refer to animals as moral agents. That word will come up again and again. A moral agent refers to a rational being that has the power to deliberate, make decisions, act on them or not act on them, and thus we take for granted that agents ought to be held morally accountable, culpable. The thing is, animals are not such beings. This is why we don't say bad wolf when the wolf eats a deer. They don't have a what? They don't have a choice in the matter. They don't have a concept of murder, etc., etc. They are not beings that operate like that. Animals are not moral agents, so this statement is false. Now, the other problem here is there is no mention of human animals in this first premise. The conclusion makes reference to human animals. No connection has been made in order to make any connection about human animals here, because it hasn't even been mentioned once in the premises. This argument is invalid and has a single false premise. Ergo, it is unsound. Now, the author contends, let's not beat up on meat eaters too much, because whenever we find an argument that is problematic, and I want to put this idea on the board, it is not in the book, but it is philosophically worth noting. Intellectually honest people who care about the truth ought to apply what philosophers sometimes call the principle of charity. The principle of charity refers to this idea that when we are examining other people's arguments, we ought to be intellectually honest and give them the benefit of the doubt as much as possible, rather than merely trying to win the argument. Because truth seekers, rather than attacking a weak version of an argument, instead would like to look at a stronger version of the argument and see if it passes muster. Now, I am making the distinction between charitably analyzing the best possible argument for a particular position versus attacking what we call some of you may have heard of this in a speech or other class, versus attacking a straw man. When we attack a straw man, we attack the absolutely weakest version of an argument. So we can quickly say, look, see how stupid the people who hold that view are. And then we quickly kick it to the curb. The problem is we haven't actually won any arguments because we haven't really taken on the strongest argument that could be made for that position. So the author of our text says, well, let's be charitable here. Let's look at a slightly stronger version of the argument and see if it passes muster. Let me read it to you. It says, if it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, then it is morally acceptable for human animals to kill and eat non-human animals. Now, the second premise says it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another. Now, the alleged conclusion is, therefore, it is morally acceptable for human animals to kill and eat non-human animals. Now, I'm just going to do the old ... so I don't have my back to you. Also, you can review this in the book. Folks, this argument reconstructed actually is a valid structure, and I have the name of this structure mentioned in your notes, and you may have heard this before. Let me unpack this so you can look at it structurally. And for those of you who have heard this before or noticed this in the textbook, we can take complex arguments in everyday language and we can convert it to symbols. Now, why would we want to go and do something like that? So we can see the structure of the argument and determine if it's valid or not. Because validity is not determined by the content of the argument. Validity is determined by the structure. Now, once we have uncovered whether or not an argument is valid or not, then we call that second question. Are the premises true? Now, if they're true, and it's valid, the conclusion will follow by logical necessity. Now, if they're not true, then the argument is unsound. Now, let's go through this. If it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat each other, I'm going to symbolize that as N, that entire phrase. Now, you can use any letter you want. I tend to choose letters that tend to encapsulate a main term or concept. If it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat each other, then it is morally acceptable for human animals to kill and eat each other. Now, folks, this structure right here, and I hope you can see this. This first premise is what we call a conditional statement. We call them conditionals because they are if-then statements that say, on condition that this is the case, then we can conclude that this is also the case. Now, folks, another symbol that logicians sometimes use to symbolize the conditional relationship, instead of the arrow, you might see a sideways horseshoe. How many of you have seen anything like this in a math class where you talked about those things called truth tables? A couple of you have. Now, it doesn't matter if you've seen this before or not. You don't need to have seen it before. I was just giving you an example of somewhere else where you may have encountered this kind of material. Now, the second premise says it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat each other. So what should be my second line? N. Because this second premise merely asserts the first side of the conditional. And in case you want the lingo, even though it won't show up on a test, the inside of a conditional is called the antecedent. This side of the conditional is called the consequent. Now take a guess what conclusion we have. It is morally acceptable for human animals to kill and eat non-human animals. Folks, this is a valid structure, and I have it right here. Reconstructed, this argument is a valid structure called modus ponens. Modus ponens is a Latin phrase, and it roughly translates to affirming the antecedent. Modus ponens. Modus ponens is valid. So reconfigured, this argument now is valid. But of course, we still have to call the question. Are the premises, in fact, true? The answer is no, because both of these premises are what? Both of them are false. Therefore, the argument is still unsound. Because keep in mind, folks, even if it is morally acceptable for animals, and by the way, it's not, because animals are not moral agents, so it's already a falsehood. Even if it were morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, it wouldn't necessarily follow for us. Because we are agents, they are not. Now, I'm not saying that it's not morally acceptable for human beings to kill and eat animals. What I'm saying is the evidence is not here. You can't draw conclusions unless the information is presented so that we can bring it to bear. So this is a false premise. And by the way, folks, this is also a false premise because we said that animals are not moral agents. So talking about morally right for animals to eat animals is a misnomer. So this argument also fails. It fails because while it is valid, it has false premises. This is another way in which an argument can fail. Now, to cheat ahead for you folks, to give you a little bit of advice, when we are doing logical analysis throughout this course, the author will actually label out for you arguments for various positions that he will intentionally unpack as valid arguments. So validity typically won't be the issue. Take a guess what your job will be. Yeah, to see if it's sound. In other words, to think meaningfully about whether or not the premises are definitively true or if they are problematic. Now, folks, keep this in mind also, and this is not in the book. Simply because we have found that a particular argument for a particular position is unsound, does that mean that the conclusion is false? That answer is no. Because keep in mind, there might be other arguments for a particular position that we have not actually looked at yet. All we have determined here is that this argument fails. There might be other arguments out there. And technically, in a strange sense, debate over these kinds of issues tends to be seldom, if ever, settled. Because it's always possible that somebody else might come along and try to provide some other argument in order to support a position that we haven't seen before. What I'm making a long-winded argument for it here is, do your best to keep an open mind and keep in mind that other arguments might come along in the future that may be worth examining. Don't ever be too sure that you have all of the darn answers. Now, in my notes, and I have these here, I have a couple of other structures that I want you to know. I already showed you Modus Ponens. I showed you disjunctive syllogism. Now, two other forms that will show up, and these are fairly basic deductions. These will show up moving forward in the book. Modus Tollens looks like this. I'll write it again over here. If it's the case that P, then it's the case that Q. Our second premise says, but it's not the case that Q. Guess what I can definitively conclude? Therefore, it's not P. And I'll go for the non-ethical example. If this animal is a wallaby, then this animal is a marsupial. But this here animal isn't a marsupial. You can definitively conclude it can't be a wallaby. Because in order to be a wallaby, it's got to fit into that category marsupial. This is a valid structure. As long as you plug in true premises, it will always spit out a true conclusion. Next one. Hypothetical syllogism. I'm just going to abbreviate it because it's already on the board. This one reads this way. If it's the case that P, then it's the case that Q. And if it's the case that Q, then it's the case that R. Therefore, if it's the case that P, then it's the case that R. Now, this one students usually don't find counterintuitive in any way, because most folks can see that these two premises are somehow related to one another, because they both refer to the term Q. And I'll give you the easy, non-ethical example. If it's a wallaby, then it's a marsupial. And if it's a marsupial, then it's a mammal. Ergo, if it's a wallaby, then it's a mammal. Now, you'll notice I'm going for the easy examples here just to get you comfortable with them. We will be seeing ones related to ethics moving forward. Now, let me give you one more illustration. Now, here's a long-winded illustration that I have concocted for you. And guess what? You might see arguments like this in real life. If the right to life is absolute, we'll be talking about rights to life and things like this later on in the course, then abortions are immoral under all circumstances. If abortions are immoral under all circumstances, then abortions are immoral even in cases where a mother's life is in danger due to the pregnancy. Now let's unpack these. This example is not in the book. I write it. If the right to life is absolute, then it's immoral under all circumstances. Now that second premise I read off says, if abortion is immoral under all circumstances, then it's even immoral in cases where a mother's life is in danger due to pregnancy. Now, is it relevant what letters I've selected? No, it's not relevant what letters I've selected. You can use P's, Q's, and R's. For my convenience, I like to pick letters that sum up a main concept in the phrase. Now, my next premise, which I did raise, says, but abortions cannot be immoral in cases in which a potential mother's life is in danger if her right to life is absolute. Now, that's a long and convoluted statement, but take a guess what it reduces to. It reduces to not D. Now, the beauty here is we have a darn convoluted third premise there, but it really just amounted to this. Now, doing deductive logic can help you out because you have to translate something convoluted and perhaps difficult to understand structurally and to put it into its basic structure. Now, the conclusion says, therefore, the right to life is not absolute. Now, the question, ladies and gentlemen, is, does this conclusion follow from the premises? The short answer is yes. This argument is valid. Now, simply because it's valid doesn't necessarily mean that it's sound. But I can demonstrate for you why this is valid. And by the way, you won't have to do anything like this in the course. But if you comprehend what I'm doing right now, you will be better off. If this were a logic class, you would be forced to do something called a demonstration, aka a proof. How many of you remember doing proofs in geometry or somewhere? Some of you might be having flashbacks even mentioning the word proof. Don't worry, because you're not going to be held to some insane proof standard here. Now, in order to determine whether or not this is valid, what you have to see is if you can derive this conclusion based upon, and I'll use the geometry word, based upon what is given. In other words, Can we draw this conclusion based upon the following premises? Now, this can actually be demonstrated quickly. Now, because I know that it's C then D, but not D, take a guess what I can draw. It's C then D, but not D. I can derive not C. And the shorthand that I would use to demonstrate how I can do that, for those of you who can't see it as well, it says MT23. MT is an abbreviation for Modus Tollens. Modus Tollens using premise 2 and premise 3. Now, what I've merely done here is shown why I'm allowed to make that move. I am shown why it's a legal, logical move. Because remember, you're not allowed to draw any inferences that are not ones that can definitively be drawn logically. Number 5, I can infer not R. Now, why can I infer not R? Because I have if R then C, but not C. Therefore, not R. Derived by Modus Tollens, premise 1 and derived premise 4. It has been demonstrated. That is how we would go through something like a deductive proof. Now, I can show you some more examples, or I should say, I will be showing you more examples moving forward. Because whenever we look at the first content chapters of the textbook pertaining to the hedonistic account of happiness, don't be surprised if you see the author going through some of the popular arguments made in favor or against hedonism, and then he will be putting them into valid logical structures. And then your job will be to consider whether or not the premises are definitively true. So the point is, you will be seeing these structures again and again. So if at first they haven't penetrated the deepest levels of your brain, they will sink in gradually. And take a guess what terminology I will be using. I will be pointing out when arguments take the form Modus Ponens. I will point out when it's Modus Tollens. I will point out when it's hypothetical syllogism. And just as another cheat ahead, those are the 3 main deductive structures that the author will be looking at throughout the book. And the good news is all 3 of those structures are fairly what? They're pretty simple once you get used to them. Now, cheers until next time. And don't forget to be prepared for this material on this chapter and to read ahead to hedonism.